The air in Chicago during the autumn of 1970 carried a heavy electric tension that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement of West Madison Street. It was a season of change, but no one expected the tectonic shift that was about to occur within the walls of Chicago Stadium. The Worlds Collide exhibition wasn't just a sporting event, it was a philosophical execution waiting to happen. On one side stood the undisputed queen of professional wrestling, a woman who redefined the limits of human strength. On the other, a martial arts icon who sought to prove that the human spirit and technical precision could overcome the raw laws of physics. Big Bear Barbara Morrison was not merely a champion. She was a force of nature. At 27 years old, she stood a towering 6 feet tall and weighed in at a staggering 275 pounds. This wasn't the soft weight of a sedentary life, but farm-raised Minnesota strength. Barbara had spent her youth tossing hay bales that weighed as much as grown men and wrestling stubborn cattle into submission on her family's dairy farm. Her muscles were dense, functional, and terrifying. In the squared circle of the WWE, she had been an absolute sovereign for 3 years. She didn't just win matches, she dismantled people. Her signature bear hug crush was the stuff of locker room nightmares, having legitimately sent 5 professional challengers to the hospital with fractured ribs and collapsed lungs. To the wrestling public, she was invincible, a modern-day Goliath in a sequined singlet. The catalyst for the event was almost accidental. Bruce Lee was in the Windy City, far from the neon lights of Hong Kong or the film sets of Hollywood. He was there to film a commercial for a high-end watchmaker, moving with the quiet, cat-like grace that defined his every waking moment. When the WWE promoters caught wind of his presence, they saw a golden opportunity. The 1970s were a time when style versus style debates raged in bars and gyms across the country. Could a nimble martial artist survive the crushing weight of a professional powerhouse? The promoter, a man with a keen eye for spectacle and a thin mustache, approached Bruce with a proposal that felt more like a dare. "Barbara has been talking, Bruce," the promoter said, leaning over a mahogany desk. "She says your movie fighting wouldn't last a minute against the real athlete. She's been calling out the entire martial arts community. We want to see if you're willing to stand up for your craft." Bruce was initially dismissive. He wasn't a circus act, and he had no desire to participate in the choreographed theatrics often associated with professional wrestling. However, the promoter played a final card. He showed Bruce a tape of Barbara's latest interview on a local Chicago sports program. On the screen, Barbara leaned back in her chair, her massive shoulders nearly wider than the frame. She laughed, a deep, booming sound that shook the microphone. "Those kung fu guys," she sneered, waving a hand that looked like a dinner plate. "They do their little dances and their hand chops, but in a real ring, they'd cry for their mothers. Take that Bruce Lee fellow. He's what, 130 pounds? I've got barn cats bigger than him. I'd squash him like a bug. It wouldn't even be a fight. It would be a tragedy." Bruce watched the screen, his expression unreadable, his jaw set. It wasn't the insult to his person that bothered him. It was the dismissal of the science he had spent his life perfecting. He turned to the promoter. "I will do it," Bruce said, his voice a calm contrast to Barbara's thunder. "But under my conditions. It will be a legitimate submission match. No striking, strictly grappling. No predetermined ending. And every cent of my purse goes to the Chicago Children's Hospital." The news of the signing broke like a lightning strike. The contrast was too delicious for the press to ignore. The 275-pound Minnesota giant versus the 140 Sep MW Dragon. The weigh-in took place at a grand downtown hotel. The room was suffocatingly crowded with cigar smoke and the frantic clicking of cameras. Barbara arrived first, draped in a custom-made wrestling robe that struggled to contain her physique. When she shed the robe to step onto the scale, a collective gasp echoed through the room. Her biceps measured 21 inches, larger than the thighs of many of the journalists in attendance. Her back was an expansive knotted muscle, a literal wall of flesh. When the scale hit 275 pounds, she flexed, her veins tracing max across her arms. She was the picture of absolute physical dominance. 30 minutes later, Bruce Lee walked in. He looked impossibly small in comparison. Clad in simple slacks and a white shirt, he appeared almost delicate next to the gargantuan wrestlers lingering in the hallways. When he stepped onto the scale, it settled at 140 pounds. The math was horrifying for his fans. He was outweighed by 135 pounds. He was facing a human being who was essentially two of him stitched together with the strength of a bull. A journalist from the Chicago Tribune shouted, "Bruce, are you suicidal? How can you possibly stop someone who can pick you up with one hand?" Bruce offered a thin, enigmatic smile. "Weight is a number on a scale," he replied. In a fight, weight is just energy. If you know how to direct that energy, it becomes a burden for the person carrying it. I respect Barbara's power, but strength without the wisdom of leverage is just a slow-moving target. Barbara, hearing this, stepped into Bruce's personal space. She towered over him, her shadow completely engulfing his frame. She looked down at him, her eyes burning with the confidence of a woman who had never known defeat. "Listen to me, little man," she growled, her voice carrying to the back of the hall. "Tomorrow night, there won't be any cameras to edit the footage. There won't be any stuntmen to take the fall. I'm gonna wrap my arms around you and squeeze until your ribs snap like dry kindling. I'm going to make you tap out so fast, the audience will miss it if they blink. You're in a real world now." She shoved her massive hand forward for the traditional stare-down handshake. It was a power move intended to crush his knuckles before the match even began. Bruce took the hand. His grip wasn't a show of force, but a steady, grounded connection. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. For a brief second, the room went silent as the two stared at each other, the immovable object and the unstoppable force. As the crowds trickled out of the hotel, the betting odds were astronomical. No one in Chicago, perhaps no one in the world, believed that the 140-pound man could survive the first 2 minutes. The newspapers the next morning ran a photo of the handshake under the headline, "The Sacrificial Lamb." But Bruce Lee wasn't going to the stadium to be a sacrificial lamb. But Bruce Lee wasn't going to the stadium to be a sacrifice. He was going there to demonstrate a truth that the world of raw power had forgotten. As the sun set over Lake Michigan on October 17th, 18,000 people began filing into the stadium, unaware that they were about to witness the death of a myth. The house lights dimmed, plunged into a momentary darkness. The tea sent a hush over the stadium before a single spotlight cut through the haze. The booming chords of country music, Barbara's signature theme, erupted from the speakers. Barbara's signature theme erupted from the speakers. The Big Bear emerged from the curtain, and the roar from the crowd was deafening. She walked with a heavy, purposeful gait, her massive shoulders rolling with every step. She wore a deep crimson wrestling singlet and a championship belt draped over her shoulder that looked like a toy against her frame. As she climbed through the ropes, she didn't just enter the ring, she claimed it. She stood in the center, arms raised, her 21-inch biceps bulging under the bright lights. She looked like a monument of Minnesota granite. Barbara began her warm-up, pacing the canvas like a caged predator. Her coach, a grizzled veteran of the wrestling circuit named Iron Mike, whispered final instructions in her ear. He knew she was strong, but he wanted her to be efficient. "Don't play with him, Barb," he muttered. "Close the distance, grab the waist, and end it. Don't let him breathe." Then the music changed. A rhythmic, steady drumbeat filled the arena. There were no pyrotechnics for Bruce Lee. He walked down the aisle with a terrifying level of focus. He had removed his shirt, revealing a physique that looked less like a bodybuilder and more like an anatomical drawing. Every muscle was stripped of fat, every fiber visible through skin that looked like stretched parchment. He weighed half as much as Barbara, but he looked like he was made of high-tensile steel wire. When Bruce stepped into the ring, the visual contrast was jarring. Standing across from Barbara, he looked like a child facing a giant. Barbara stood 8 inches taller and nearly 3 times as wide. She looked at Bruce and smirked, a look of genuine pity crossing her face. She leaned over to the referee and whispered, "Make sure the doctors are ready." "I don't want to break him too badly." The referee, a stern man with Olympic credentials, called them to the center. "You know the rules?" He barked, "No striking. This is a grappling match. You go until someone taps out or passes out. Keep it clean." He checked their hands, then stepped back. "Fighters ready, begin." The bell rang, a sharp metallic sound that signaled the start of the 45 seconds that would be analyzed for the next half century. Barbara didn't hesitate. She exploded forward with a speed that shocked the audience. She knew that in a wrestling match, the one who dictates the space wins. Her plan was to use her 1-3-5 outweighed advantage as a battering ram. She drove her shoulder forward, reaching for Bruce's neck and waist, intending to pull him into her chest and collapse his lungs in a clinch. Bruce moved. It wasn't a jump or a frantic scramble, it was a glide. Using the footwork he had mastered through years of studying fencing and boxing, he stepped laterally at a 45-degree angle. Barbara's massive hands caught only air. Her momentum carried her past him, and she had to plant her feet hard to keep from crashing into the turnbuckle. The crowd gasped. They had never seen anyone move that fast. Barbara turned, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and rising anger. "Stay still, you little monkey," she hissed. She began to circle, cutting off the angles of the ring more carefully this time. She was a championship wrestler. She knew how to trap an opponent. She forced Bruce into a corner, narrowing the space until there was nowhere left for him to glide. Sensing her moment, she lunged again. This time, it wasn't a tackle, but a calculated grab. Her massive arms, thick as tree trunks, wrapped around Bruce's midsection. The stadium erupted. She had him. Barbara locked her hands behind Bruce's back, initiating her legendary bear hug. She planted her feet, arched her spine, and began to squeeze with the same force she used to break the ribs of heavyweight wrestlers. This was the moment everyone had paid to see. They expected Bruce to gasp, his face to turn purple, and his hand to frantically slap her shoulder in surrender. But Bruce Lee did something that defied the logic of the spectators. Instead of tensing up to fight her strength, which would have been a death sentence, he went soft. He utilized a principle from Wing Chun and Tai Chi known as sinking the weight. He relaxed his upper body completely, becoming like a sack of heavy sand in her arms. Simultaneously, he tucked his chin and positioned his forearms against her chest, creating a structural frame. This frame, backed by the alignment of his skeleton rather than his muscles, prevented Barbara from fully collapsing his ribcage. He wasn't fighting her 275 pounds with his 140 pounds. He was using the geometry of his bones to hold her at bay. Barbara's face turned a deep shade of purple, but not from lack of oxygen. It was from the sheer exertion of the squeeze. She couldn't understand it. She was putting enough pressure to crush a steel barrel, yet the man in her arms was breathing rhythmically. He was looking her right in the eyes, calm and detached. Frustration boiled over. Barbara decided to change levels. She shifted her grip, intending to lift him off the mat and slam him down to break his structural frame. But in that tiny window of transition, the moment her grip loosened by a fraction of an inch to reposition, Bruce struck, not with a fist, but with movement. He felt the shift in her center of gravity. As she leaned back to lift, Bruce borrowed her backwards momentum. He pivoted his hips with lightning speed, hooking his leg behind her massive calf. It was a classic judo trip, executed with the precision of a surgeon. The audience watched in, slow motion disbelief as the 275-pound champion began to tip. Because she was so committed to her own pull, she had no way to regain her balance. Bruce didn't push her. He simply guided her fall. The sound of Barbara Morrison hitting the canvas was like a thunderclap. The entire ring shook, the wooden planks groaning under the impact. But Bruce didn't let go. As they hit the mat, he flowed over her like water. Before Barbara could even process that she was on her back, Bruce had transitioned. He scrambled behind her with the agility of a panther, his legs locking around her waist in a body triangle. This position allowed him to use his lower body to control her massive hips, neutralizing her leg strength. Then, his right arm snaked under her chin. Then, his right arm snaked under her chin. The crowd went from a deafening roar to a haunting pin-drop silence. They were seeing something they couldn't comprehend. The giant was on the ground, and the smaller man was on her back, his arm locked deep across her throat. "She's in trouble," someone yelled from the front row. Barbara's coach was at the edge of the apron, screaming, "Roll, Barb, roll, get your back to the mat." Barbara tried. She tried to use her immense power to stand up with Bruce on her back, but the way he had distributed his weight made it feel like she was trying to lift a mountain that was perfectly balanced to tip her over. Every move she made only tightened the noose. This wasn't a choke in the way wrestlers knew it. It wasn't a crush of the windpipe. Bruce was applying a blood choke, targeting the carotid arteries. As the 40-second mark passed, Barbara's world began to go dark at the edges. Her legendary strength was useless against a technique that bypassed the muscles and went straight for the brain's fuel supply. Her hands flailed behind her, searching for Bruce's head, his hair, anything, but he was tucked tight, an inseparable P. Art of her own shadow. The 18,000 fans stood as one, sensing the impossible. The Big Bear, the woman who had never been pinned, was fading. By the 42-second mark, the roar of Chicago Stadium had vanished, replaced by a thick, heavy vacuum of disbelief. Barbara's face, usually a mask of defiant Minnesota pride, was now a deep, alarming shade of maroon. Her eyes, wide and searching, darted toward her coach, but her vision was tunneling into a narrow pinprick of light. The blood choke, the Hataka Gym, was doing its work with clinical efficiency. By compressing the carotid arteries, Bruce was effectively putting her brain to sleep, bypassing her 275 pounds of muscle entirely. In a final, desperate act of survival, Barbara tried to throw her entire body weight backward, hoping to crush Bruce against the canvas. It was a move that would have snapped the spine of a lesser grappler. But Bruce anticipated the shift. As she fell back, he tucked his head and adjusted his hips, maintaining the seal of the choke, even as the impact rattled the ring's foundation. Then came the sound. Thwack, thwack, thwack. 3 distinct slaps of a heavy palm against the blue canvas. The Big Bear had tapped out. The referee, frozen for a microsecond by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing, lunged forward and grabbed Bruce's shoulder. "Release, release. It's over," Bruce Lee let go instantly. There was no victory dance, no grandstanding, and no sneer of triumph. He rolled off her back and immediately moved to her side, hooking his arms under her legs to elevate them, a technique to help the blood return to the brain and speed up recovery. It was the act of a martial artist who viewed combat as a science, not a grudge. For a full 10 seconds, the 18,000 fans sat in a silence so profound, it felt as though the stadium had been emptied of air. Then, the explosion happened. It wasn't just a cheer. It was a riot of sound, half the audience screaming in jubilation at the underdog's victory, the other half booing in a state of shock, unable to accept that their champion had been vanquished in less time than it takes to boil an egg. Barbara sat up slowly, coughing, her hand instinctively going to her throat. She looked around the ring, her eyes landing on Bruce, who was now standing calmly in the corner, wiping a thin sheen of sweat from his forehead with a towel. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been defeated not by a movie star, but by a master of a craft she hadn't even begun to understand. The referee walked to the center of the ring and raised Bruce's hand. The announcement was brief. The winner by submission in 45 seconds, Bruce Lee. The post-match scene was chaotic. Journalists scrambled over the barricades, and photographers' flashbulbs turned the ring into a strobe-like fever dream. Mike Terrell, the veteran journalist, stood at ringside with his mouth literally hanging open. His notepad, intended for a blow-by-blow account of a wrestling clinic, contained only one sentence: God is a martial artist. The ring announcer climbed through the ropes, thrusting a microphone toward Barbara, who was being helped to her feet by her shell-shocked coach. Her breathing was still ragged, and the red marks of Bruce's forearm were clearly visible on her neck. "Barbara," the announcer stammered. What happened out there?" Barbara looked at the microphone, then at the 140 and hand man standing 10 feet away. The arrogance that had defined her for 3 years had evaporated. "I don't know," she said, her voice raspy. "I had him. I had the squeeze. I had broken bulls with that squeeze. But he felt like he wasn't there. And then, before I could blink, the world went dark. It wasn't wrestling. It was like fighting a ghost who knew exactly where my off switch was." She paused, then did something that earned her more respect than any of her championship wins. She walked over to Bruce Lee and extended her hand, not for a power play handshake this time, but in a gesture of genuine humility. "You're no movie fighter," she told him. "You're the real deal." Bruce took her hand and bowed slightly. "You have great strength, Barbara," he said, loud enough for the nearby microphones to catch. "But the tiger must also learn the way of the water. Strength is a tool, but efficiency is the master." The aftermath of that night rippled through the sporting world for decades. The Worlds Collide event became the stuff of legend, a proto-MA moment that preceded the UFC by more than 20 years. For the WWE, it was a moment of profound realization that the tough man era was evolving. Barbara Morrison, true to her word, didn't let the defeat embitter her. She took a 6-month hiatus and traveled to California, where she reportedly spent time studying the mechanics of grappling and leverage. Realizing that her 275 pounds could be 10 times more effective if she understood the why behind the how. She defended her title 4 more times over the next 3 years, incorporating a new, more technical style that made her even more dominant. When she retired in 1973, she remained the most successful women's champion in history, but she never did another interview without mentioning that 45-second lesson in Chicago. As for Bruce Lee, he vanished back into his world of philosophy and film. He refused to accept any trophies or commemorative plaques for the match. True to his word, the massive burst from the event, boosted by the record-breaking gate and closed-circuit TV rights, was hand-delivered to the Chicago Children's Hospital. To Bruce, the match wasn't about proving he was better than Barbara, it was about you proving that a small man with a focused mind could navigate a world built for giants. 50 years later, Barbara's coach, Iron Mike, passed away without ever giving a full interview about that night. His only recorded comment on the match was found in a letter to a friend. "We thought we were bringing a bear to a dogfight. We didn't realize we were bringing a bear to a surgeon." The 45 seconds in Chicago Stadium remains a ghost in the archives of combat sports. A moment when the world stood still and a 140-pound man showed 18,000 people that the greatest strength of all is the one you cannot see.